Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be here today. I'd firstly like to extend my gratitude to BIOMIN for the invitation to this conference, which I have to say the quality of the speeches so far have been absolutely fantastic. I think lined up very nicely leading into my presentation about Industry 4.0. I'll also start off by saying that I agree with Jan. I think this is a truly amazing industry. And I also believe that we are at the cusp of some fundamental changes which will lead to both opportunities and challenges that we need to meet and that we need to face head on. And I actually believe, and I'll be a little bit stronger in my messaging, I think we're going to need to have a fundamental rethink about the agriculture industry. And why is that? Let's have a look at this slide. It's a huge industry. It also happens to be the oldest industry in the world. Unfortunately with that, it probably is still today the most inefficient industry. Now that may sound bad. Being a management consultant, I look at it from a positive perspective. It means that things can only get better. It means that there can only be opportunity. And I think the reason why it is such an inefficient industry is because we're faced with a very long and complex value chain, right? You start by your inputs, you then have to grow your products. Typically, those products may be processed not once, twice, but 3 times along that value chain before they end up in your plate. And of course, these goods can start in one corner of the world and end up in a completely different corner. I think the other reason why this industry has been fundamentally inefficient is due to the very high labor content that we have. And if we talk about certain crops, we talk about certain regions, it is clear that smallholders are still very, very, very important to this industry. And I worry that we don't take care enough of our farmers. I think this is, again, where technology can play a role right down to the farmer level. So let's have a look at some of these challenges that we're faced with and take a look at some of the technologies which are starting to be deployed, and along with it some of the investments that are being poured into the industry. And there are more and more of these investments, and I'll show you that in a subsequent slide that's up and coming. So on the left-hand side, we have some of the key challenges. So we can see the high demand for animal protein, which I think has been extremely well covered in some of the presentations this morning. We've just had a fantastic talk about the efficient uses of resources. I think one area we haven't talked about enough is urbanization. And I think this is having a fundamental impact on the industry. Why? Because one, we have farmers who are now moving to cities. The cost of labor is increasing tremendously and most certainly is not sustainable. Even in lower cost labor regions, I talk to my oil palm customers. I'm based in Singapore, have been for the last 15 plus years. They're really starting to feel the pinch of labor. Higher consumer demands. I think it's more than just higher consumer demands. I think that there's a fundamental shift in what we're going to eat, how we're going to eat it, and when we're going to eat it. And we're seeing that certainly very much so in the West. I mean, you take the US as an example. 15 years ago, eating out was only 25% of activity. Now it's over 50%. So real fundamental shifts. And I think a great deal of fragmentation in that consumer demand and that consumer shift that we also have to meet. And last but not least, again, I think touched upon very nicely in the last presentation, the issue of sustainability and animal welfare. And we can see at the top the different types of technologies currently being deployed, which I'll go into in more depth in a second, and the amount of investment going into the industry. And not unsurprisingly, a lot of that has been around e-commerce and food and beverage. But I think as you'll see in some of the ensuing slides, we're seeing tremendous shift in technology getting into the feed and animal feed sector. So if we look at ag tech, I think we can take technology at large. I mean, this is not just about, say, robotics or about blockchain. I think technologies are across the board and needs to enable us to meet these challenges, right? And technologies that succeed are ones that address pain points that we're faced with. And it's happening very quickly. A lot of these technologies are already coming into play. This slide, I'd almost say, is already outdated. It was one that we did about a year ago, and we can see that we put blockchain in the long term. Well, I actually argue that in the last year there's been tremendous progress in blockchain. And I think for these technologies to be successful, they'll probably have to work hand in hand. So 5 years ago or so, we started to talk about IoT, and everybody, I think, is quite familiar about the Internet of Things, and sensors are key to enabling IoT. And then suddenly we had blockchain starting to be the next hot thing, and more recently it's artificial intelligence or blockchain. My belief is that it's really a confluence of these different technologies coming together, working hand in hand, which are going to be the holy grail. And I think for the ag industry, that's going to be certainly automation coupled with IoT, coupled with blockchain, and coupled with artificial intelligence. And I think the other thing that we don't really focus on enough, and I think to a large extent is where the gold, as it were, may lie, is in the data. Right? That long, complex, inefficient value chain is full of data. Right? We know it's there, but so far we've not been able to mine that data and really use it to our benefit. And we saw, Jan's charts this morning, which I think were fantastic charts, over how on the one hand, yes, cost and lowest cost producers also always typically win. But I think moving forward, we do need to focus increasingly on margins. We need to focus on differentiation, and we need to take a look at long-term investments to be successful. And I think a lot of that opportunity to reduce those costs, to improve those margins, is actually in the data. But without coupling the hardware with the software and the analytics that come with it, we're not going to be able to mine that successfully. Very quickly, the proof is in the pudding. This is the level of investment that's being poured into ag tech. Right. We go back to the boom of the internet days, and I think any sort of business plan could easily get funded, and you could make a lot of money without having any revenues. I think today there's increasing interest in the ag sector because people realize the opportunity that we have in front of us. Do we need to be patient with it? Absolutely. I mean, again, this is not your pure internet or telco play. This is agriculture that we're talking about. Right? Agriculture is a mid to long-term play. But again, I think investors have realized the opportunity that technology has to enable all these challenges and opportunities that we're faced with, enable to unlock inherent value that we've not been able to unlock so far. And I think, interestingly, those investments are coming from different quarters. It's not just traditional venture capitalists that have been pouring money into ag tech. It's actually companies heavily involved in the agricultural sector, whether it's food and beverage companies, or indeed whether it's even feed additive companies, who have set up their own venture capital arms to invest in very interesting developments across the value chain. And I'll show you a slide which depicts where some of these investments have been taking place along that value chain in a second. In terms of how this industry is starting to shape up, we see there really being sort of 4 key areas that technology is addressing. I think the first one, which probably comes to mind to everybody first, is going to be in the ag tech operations. So the top left-hand corner where we talk about the robotics, the IoT, sensing, big data, the drones, precision nutrition, etc. I think clearly a lot of gains and opportunity to be had in that. But I think it's going way beyond just the operations. We're also seeing finance adopting technology very rapidly. So, for example, insurance companies, are very interested to better understand what's actually happening on the ground at a farm level, get better analytics over, say, the potential yields of farms and the potential risks that those farms may face with regards to weather, and starting to change the way that they're charging for their premiums, right? And again, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the farming industry still relies on smallholders. I think there's tremendous opportunity for things such as microinsurance. I take a look at the Asia-Pacific market, and other than countries like Thailand and the Philippines, who have started to make some fairly good inroads with regards to microinsurance, the great majority of countries do not have such insurance. And if we are to protect our industry, we need to ensure that we're going to be giving those farmers the right tools in their hands. I think also regulation. I think the last presentation started to touch upon some of the issues around welfare that we're faced with. But even without that, taking a step back, do we know what we're really eating when it lands on our plate? Do we know where it comes from? Do we know what's actually gone inside it? That Wagyu beef or that tiger prawn that you're eating, is it really a tiger prawn, or is it vaname? Right? Where's it come from? What's gone inside? There is a lot of fake food out in the market, and we have got to find ways to regulate that, because it's not good for the consumer, and I certainly don't think it's good for the farmers, because if we come back to the issue of quality and being able to properly reward our consumers, and we saw one of the charts earlier from Rabobank how the poultry industry, for example, is changing and moving away from what has been classified as a standard chicken more towards premium goods. We have got to ensure that we actually get paid for that. And in many instances, we have real issues, even coming back to, say, antibiotics. Right? That move away from antibiotics, I think, is certainly going to continue to be a big trend, and we're certainly seeing that even in Asia starting to increase. But how can we prove the provenance and the quality of our food? And I think this is where things like blockchain and track and trace give us the ability to do that. And that's also why I think that the industry will continue to integrate, because unless we have an integrated industry, it's very hard to actually track and trace the goods through that. So as I alluded, there've got to be real gains, right? And those gains can't be for just one part of the value chain or one part of society. It's got to be across the whole value chain. So it's those increased revenues, margins, reduced costs. I think the ability to improve customer stickiness, right? Because if you're able to prove the provenance and the quality of your food, and the, for example, ethical stance that you may be taking over food, then I think we have an opportunity to be rewarded for that. So I think customers can be loyal to you. I think without a doubt it's going to be a form of enhanced competitiveness, right? Particularly in an era where I think we see more and more commoditization. I think we see more and more volatility. I think we see more and more fragmentation in the industry. The ability to drive sustainability, certainly there. The ability to start to mitigate risk. Right? Jan talked about being able to predict things, right? And this is where I think the deep learning, the AI, coupled with, again, the hardware, the software that we're able to deploy, gives us a far better opportunity to predict how crops are going to perform, how livestock are going to perform. And that data, therefore, allows us to adjust to those potential threats that are up and coming and mitigate that risk. And last but not least, again, we've touched upon this a little bit, improve animal welfare. I mentioned earlier that I think it's hugely interesting because I'm sure all of you are sitting here in the audience and you're involved in different parts of the value chain, and you're saying, well, how is this actually relevant for me? Is it really happening? Are there gains? And this slide is just a very high-level depiction of key initiatives or some initiatives that have been taking place through that value chain. And it proves that at every single level of the value chain, different types of technology, and I consider genetics as technology, are being deployed. So that I don't believe that there is anybody in this room who cannot, in one form or another, benefit from technology. Now, does that necessarily mean that you're the one who has to be making the investments into that? Because clearly it comes at a cost, right? And some of it is extremely expensive. I think for certain parties in the room, you're actually quite lucky because there are suppliers, or some of your suppliers, who are actually taking the initiative to implement that technology. And in many cases, they will actually provide that as a free service to you. I think it's very hard to actually charge for technology. But what it does mean is that, say you are someone who is supplying data to a feed miller or to a farmer, and he is able, through that data, through that technology, able to generate better margins because of your service, then clearly he is going to be more loyal to you. Clearly he is going to buy more from you. And I think also that customer is far less likely to negotiate around price. So I think there are many inherent benefits for, as I said, many people sitting here across the whole value chain when it comes to technology. I think technology also gives us the ability to rethink our business and operating models. And I think this is where there's potential for real gains in the agriculture industry. And this is what I was alluding to in my opening gambits of really rethinking what we do. Right? We're seeing a move towards urbanization, right, that we discussed. And I think we have inherent challenges getting our produce to those urban centers. I came back from the US 2 weeks ago, working on a very large agribusiness account. And one of their biggest challenges is they can't find truckers. Crazy. They cannot find people to drive trucks. So what do you have to do? Either you have to automate that process, right, through automated vehicles, or you have to bring plants closer to cities. And I believe that for certainly vegetables, we'll see a lot more in cities. Certainly in Singapore, we have hydroponics, but we've had certain companies who traditionally have manufactured semiconductors in Singapore, moved it out because it's too high a cost, who have converted that facility into making salads, and they sell it under their own brand. So companies who have not traditionally been in this industry, but have technology, say particularly around sensors, that can be used in the industry, are increasingly seeing it as an opportunity to deploy technologies. I think fish farms will go vertical. They'll go closer to cities. It's already starting to happen. And certainly Asia, where aqua is very, very important. I think we'll see actually a lot of the innovations coming out of Asia for this. So I think we have an opportunity through, they say, because technology is really a means to an end, right? But it does give us the opportunity to rethink our business and operating models. And we've seen this in other industries, right? Where were the Airbnbs? Where were the Ubers 5 years ago, right? The traditional forms of competitiveness, which were cost, assets, brand, and people, are now being supplemented by technology and different business and operating models, right? So we as an industry have to take that into consideration. And I actually truly believe that whilst agriculture may have been behind other industries in technology adoption, like, say, finance and insurance, I think commodities as a whole and agriculture probably stand to gain the most from these technologies. And again, I think in the last year or two, the pace of acceleration in that technology adoption and use has been absolutely phenomenal, right? And I wish I could have shown you a chart of all the companies who are involved in the sector, and you'd see just how much is going on, particularly, I would say, in the US, followed by Australia in terms of the innovation. But what we've done instead over the next couple of slides is just give you an idea of, or an example of some of the technologies that we're seeing being deployed. So dairy, I think dairy in particular has been a tremendous beneficiary of technologies, whether it's IoT, whether it's sensors, in the field, actually on and in the ruminant itself, or in the actual farm, and think about how fragmented the dairy industry is. Right? Today, it's the least integrated of all the industries. It's an industry where you're seeing people, very old people operating in it. For example, Japan, the average age of a dairy farmer in Japan is 63. Unless we start to consolidate those industries, unless we start to drive technology through those industries, then we're no longer going to be getting the supply that we've had in the past. Data and analytics, again, I think an area where, quite frankly, today, data is gold, right? And something to focus on. In the farm, again, we're seeing tremendous use of imagery, right? Easier to do with, say, ruminants or swine than poultry, but even in poultry, we're seeing amazing technology starting to come into play to really better understand how the livestock is behaving. Robotics, without a doubt, tremendous opportunities there. Again, I think the issue around labor and labor inefficiency means that we have to take a look at robotics and how we can continue to push robotics through the industry. Blockchain, I think, extremely useful to reduce costs, to improve the trust that we have in that value chain. And let's come back to that very important point, right? There has to be trust in the produce. There has to be trust in our farming processes. And I think something like blockchain gives us the opportunity to do that. And even 3D printing is finding a role in the industry. So last but not least, what is it that we're going to need to do for this to be successful? I mean, it sounds easy. I mean, the technologies exist. So we should be able to deploy these really easily. Well, it's a lot more difficult than that, right? Because we need to ensure that whilst we can put these technologies into place at the front end, if you don't have the back-end systems to be able to deal with all that information, then you can't mine it. Then that information, you actually need to draw out of it what is relevant, right, to you. And thirdly, you're going to have the creativity and the analytics, which often requires a human brain, not just artificial intelligence, to be able to say, well, this is what we do, and this is how we use it to get those gains. So we've listed here about 6 key different things that we think need to be done. For the sake of time, I won't go through all of them, but I think you have to have a very, very clear plan and the ability to be able to execute that plan. Otherwise, technology will fail. With that, I'll thank you very much for listening, and if we have time for questions, happy to take a question or two.